Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. My name is Brendon and I'm speaking to you today from the University of Johannesburg in South Africa. My topic today focuses on psychology and climate action in the Global South. I am going to speak about my work on youth activism in relation to climate change, and I'm going to focus specifically on the need to understand local realities and respect local realities, and also give some comments on digital futures. So we were challenged today to think about the concept of hope. Now, hope is a very interesting and complex concept. It is a powerful concept that has resonance in society and can be potentially impactful. I also know hope is a particularly rich concept that has also been studied extensively within the discipline. But rather than think through and define hope in terms of the Global South and climate action, I really asked myself the question of where can I find hope in terms of psychology and climate action in the work that I do among youth climate activists. My starting point for this talk is really about my entry into the discipline of psychology and its relationship with climate change, and really trying to grapple with how we position ourselves as psychologists in relation to climate change in the Global South. Now, this entry really started way back with me being very interested in how do we design, implement, and evaluate behavior change interventions to protect people from environmental destruction, from environmental toxins, from environmental harm. And so I began my career very early on thinking about how we implement these behavior change interventions and think about their effectiveness. I did studies on indoor air pollution, studies of water and sanitation, studies in relation to inadequate housing, and studies in relation to very well-known neurotoxins. And the key question was, how can we encourage people to change their behaviors to protect themselves from this destruction? Now, two things became very clear to me very early on. The first was that actually these kinds of interventions that were thought about from the top and were imposed almost on communities in the form of health education tended to be ineffective. There were signs that it was effective, or that they were effective initially in the short term, but over time, we really start to see that these interventions tend not to make much of a difference. There was also a political concern of mine, and that is many of these interventions were actually focusing on poor Black women in Africa. And the burden of them protecting themselves from environmental harm at the expense of us looking upstream, at the expense of us looking at the polluting industries that are causing the damage in the first place, really made me feel uneasy. At the same time, I started to acknowledge and become interested in the many, many environmental movements that were starting to take shape in relation to climate change in particular. And two things sort of dawned on me as my work progressed and as I continued to do studies looking at how do we intervene. And the first is that it is really crucial to understand and respect local realities. We really, really do not have much of a chance if we don't understand what's going on the ground. And in my case, if we don't understand what's happening within climate movements themselves. The second learning point for me was that we should consider leveraging what people are doing already. There is a lot of activity in relation to youth climate change activism. So let's understand and let's facilitate and work with them to enable us to get somewhere, both as a discipline, but also in terms of really mitigating the impacts of climate change. So this is where I start off, and this is how I hope to frame this particular talk. I wish to make 3 points. The first point is that hope can be found on the margins. And here I find hope in relation to marginalized youth really claiming their voice and reclaiming their voices when those voices have been excluded. The second thing I think that marginalized youth activism is doing really well is in relation to intersectional climate justice. And the third thing, I think, where there's a lot of activity and where I think we've been a little bit slow in the discipline of psychology is to really think through the impact of the digital sphere, of digital technologies and of social media and the fourth industrial revolution in relation to how activism is taking shape at the moment. I'll then move on to talk about the possibility to leverage what people are doing already and to get behind social movements by understanding what's happening already. And then I'll make a few comments towards the end of the presentation about reimagining a role for psychology in relation to climate activism, particularly among the youth. So the first point that I wish to impart focuses on activists reclaiming voices. Now, the starting point for this particular talk was the often widely held misconception, I believe, that African youth and youth generally in the global south are not that interested in climate change, are not that active in climate activism, and of course need certain kinds of help in order to do so. And we find this in a lot of spaces in the media, even in academic writing. So I wish to disrupt this a little bit and show how activists are in fact highly active and are also doing incredible work to have their voices heard. So to begin with, let me state that activists and activists in the global south have a very hard time in terms of how much they are undermined, how much abuse they receive online and in the real world, and also in terms of how they continually having to justify their presence. And this applies specifically to African youth activists, but also to other activists around the world. In the global north, also marginalized youth involved in climate activism. Now, there are many ways in which these activists are undermined. The first and most obvious point I want to make is the violence that often these activists have to endure. If we can just pause and reflect on the fact that over 200 murders of land and environmental defenders happened in the year 2020 alone, speaks really to the high levels of violence that activists often experience. Activists in the studies that I've done are also subject to incredible abuse and undermining because of their gender. For example, they are deemed too young or too emotional to be able to handle the activism and the strength that's perceived to be needed in climate activism. They are questioned about their motives. They are questioned about who they claim to represent. They are questioned in terms of where they are located, and some even saying that African activists should stick to African issues and not venture out into global issues. They are undermined in terms of their race. But I think for me, the real issue here is that often activists in the global south or marginalized groups in the global north have to fight on two fronts. They have to fight the issues that they are confronted with. They are heavily involved in climate change activism, and they're fighting on that front. But they also have to fight to have their voices heard within climate movements. And this is really interesting to me, how much double fighting needs to happen in order to have their voices heard. Now, what's really interesting here is I present a case study to you of the cropping out of an African activist, Vanessa Nakate. Now, in early 2020, a group of young women climate activists were engaged in various discussions at the World Economic Forum in Davos in Switzerland. Following these discussions, a picture was published of the activists. You will see the top picture that was published, but the original picture included Vanessa Nakate, who can be found at the bottom left. Vanessa was excluded from the picture that eventually made its way in the press release, and Vanessa obviously was quite upset by it, rightfully so, and accused Associated Press of racism because they cropped her picture out. The only Black person, the only African activist was left out of the picture. Now, this form of digital erasure is quite interesting because the Associated Press immediately denied accusations of racism, saying that Vanessa was removed and cropped out because of the composition of the photos. They claimed that there was an unsightly building behind her, and she was removed to remove the building. And of course, this logic doesn't quite cut it, and there was a huge furore around the issue. Importantly, Associated Press didn't apologize initially and didn't actually apologize at all for the racism, but did eventually apologize to Vanessa about the damage and the hurt that they may have caused. Now, this led to a number of things. It led to Vanessa using this in terms of her campaign to emphasize the point that this digital erasure or cropping out didn't just erase the photo of Vanessa, it also erased the continent. And here's a quote on the slide from Vanessa immediately after the cropped out incident, where she says, "You didn't just erase the photo, you erased the continent, but I'm stronger than ever." Now, sadly, this was not the only kind of digital erasure that happened. Over an 11-month period, 2 other Black women activists had similar experiences. One, Toni Nauschen from Germany, who experienced a similar incident, and also Elise Yard, who experienced the erasure of an important message by the media. Now, this is just one example of a form of erasure, a form of undermining that activists have to endure. But rather than being passive recipients of this kind of undermining, what's particularly interesting in the case studies that I've studied is how activists, including Vanessa, use their agency to make particular points. For example, Vanessa Nakate used this incident to really demonstrate what she suggests on the slide, that actually her experience is an experience that is symbolic of the widespread neglect of Africa. Subsequently, she engaged in many interviews, and quite surprisingly, she was actually attacked and undermined in many, many spheres, including by the media in Africa, also because of her accusations of racism. But whenever she was attacked, whenever she was undermined, she would use that experience to demonstrate how people are being used in various ways or are being excluded in various ways in the climate, mainstream climate activism discourse. So if she was being attacked because of her emotional reaction, she would use that as an indication of how women are treated. Most importantly, for this discussion, there are incredible moments where Vanessa Nakate, as well as other activists, are actually fighting back, are using the incidents, again, to project a different future for young climate activists, or projecting, using projective agency, to use the psychological term, to really think through the future and to use the experiences to reimagine a role for African climate activists or marginalized climate activists more generally. One thing that Vanessa did particularly well, as well as many other activists around the world from marginalized groups, is that they focus on intersectional justice. Now, here I want to make a point that for a very long time, climate activism really revolved around focusing mainly on what I would call green issues, and that is the natural world, biodiversity loss, ecosystem health, and so forth. And this is all well and good, but more and more so, young activists are coming to the party to point out the historical legacy of colonialism, imperialism, and the history of injustice, and how that carries through to the present, and how we cannot isolate climate justice and only focus on green issues. We also have to include social justice, we have to include racial justice, we have to include issues of gender, and we have to include geopolitical issues in terms of justice. So these are really important strides, I believe, in the fight for climate activists and in terms of intersectional justice, and they are doing remarkably well on this front. And we have plenty of examples. There's too little time now to show how more recently, particularly over the past 3 years, people have been coming together and groups have been forming, ranging from grassroots movements to more established movements to civil society organizations to the legal world, importantly, the legal world, coming together to fight certain environmental issues and climate issues. Now, much of this activism is actually happening in the digital sphere. And as I mentioned earlier, I believe psychologists have been a little slow to the party to understand what's happening in the digital sphere. The activists themselves are highly active, and particularly in the global south, where actually the reach of cell phones, smartphones, and the internet is growing. And there's a hell of a lot of activity, local reality activity in the digital sphere. I was recently very intrigued by the use of social media in terms of climate activism. I'm particularly interested in how social media enables the formation of climate groups, climate activist groups, some of the barriers to social media, some of the enablers to social media, and also some of the technological infrastructure that is needed. And again, by understanding what's happening in the digital sphere at this point, I believe is crucial for us as psychologists in order to get behind and support and perhaps even bring our skills to the party in terms of helping people along or facilitating climate action. Another area I think that we could do a little more work in is in relation to the internet and evidence. Now, there's a lot of fake news that gets pushed out there. There's also a huge political agenda to foster ideas of climate denialism and to counter some of the narratives that are being put forward by climate activists. And I do think we can do a lot more, both in terms of making the evidence that we have available, for example, on the impacts of climate change and mental health, make it much more available and much more user-friendly to activists and grassroots movements through the digital sphere. I also think there's tremendous opportunity in thinking through the idea of disaster management and the role of technology, social media, and digital technologies in relation to that domain. So I'll end the talk to suggest that unlike me, who started out thinking that psychology has something special to offer and thinking through ideas that we could help communities by bringing some of our ideas and cutting and pasting ideas from psychology into communities and resource poor communities themselves and learning some hard truths about how communities mobilize. I think we have tremendous amount of theory, skills, and methods to facilitate climate action. But I do think amongst psychologists and those aligned to psychology, we need to think more broadly and move away from single issue psychologies. We cannot be working in silos, and we have to be working across fields of psychology to really get behind what's happening on the ground. We also need much more work in the global south to speed up transdisciplinary work in relation to psychology and other disciplines, as well as other sectors in society. We really need to work with communities to help think through some intervention, some action in terms of mobilization, in terms of moving away, I believe, from what I call top-down psychologies. And most importantly, we need to understand and respect what's happening on the ground already. And in the case of my work, to really understand what's happening in terms of climate action and youth climate activism and what is happening on the ground already. And rather than working with communities, we really need to rethink our terminology, rethink our approach, and also to engage and embrace concepts such as allyship, accompaniment, and stewardship, and to really, really, really embrace and get behind the idea of intersectional justice, not just thinking about single issue psychologies or single issue climate change. And this is in the hope that we can actually develop a more engaged and responsive psychology. I thank you for your time. It's again a real honor to have been invited today, and I look forward to the discussions that are going to take place later today. Thank you very much.